The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.
Paul Krugman has a column in the New York Times, and he entitled the most recent one, The Return of Blood Libel. And he's trying to understand in the context of history what drives people to create entire myths around a certain group of a subset, and to use those myths, those mythologies about those individuals or about those groups as a means of vilifying them to the point of not just oppression, but extermination. Quite frankly, it's the MO of most genocides is to vilify a community, a group of people, and to create a fear of those people that pushes you into creating policy, and then not only policy, but pushes the population into excusing away and justifying the policies that ultimately lead to the oppression or the outright extermination of a people. He used, from a historical perspective, the example of the anti-Semitism that was generated to create a fear of Jewish people, which led to the Holocaust. He also juxtaposed that with the role that wealthy people who are oftentimes the driving force behind this anti-Semitism or this vilification, this creation of an entire mythos to make you fear a group of people. And he used Henry Ford as an example, who published and disseminated 500,000 copies of an anti-Semitic propaganda piece that really, to him, it made no sense. Now, to me, it makes perfect sense, right? But he was looking at it from a quote unquote economist perspective. And so he can't find, he can't draw, I guess, a moral conclusion. But he also made a really good case, and I think you should read this article. Some of his recent work I haven't really enjoyed at all, but this piece was important because he makes it clear that we do not have an immigration crisis. That when you see communities that are full of immigrants, that those communities are less likely to be violent. In addition to the fact that we have seen a decrease in crime across the country, even in major cities like New York, whose murder rates are at the levels of 1950, according to his article. So we don't have a crime problem. We don't have a murder problem. We don't have a murder problem that's exacerbated by immigrants. And even more specifically, he outlined the case that there's not any evidence to suggest that this influx of low-skilled workers has negatively affected wages. Now, he obviously said that there are disagreements, and this is an ongoing debate in the field of economics. But he said there's no overwhelming evidence to suggest that they're even depressing wages. So all of the justifications that everyone uses to vilify immigrants, specifically immigrants of color, let's be sure, all of it is really this myth, this mythos that is generated by and promulgated by some of the wealthiest people in the nation. Now, where he couldn't draw a moral conclusion, I will. This is simply the fact that you have wealthy people, you have individuals who are either opportunistically bigoted or just genuinely bigoted. Like he didn't even want to go into the fact that this is deeply rooted in the human dilemma, that people have a fear of the other, and that there are those who can monetize that fear and weaponize it and to carry them all the way to the White House. So whereas I don't know Henry Ford's justification, I haven't read enough about his anti-Semitism to know if it was just purely bigoted versus what Donald Trump is doing. I think it's both bigoted as well as opportunistic. It's kind of like the meme. Why not both? Well, I think it's actually both, that it's both opportunistic and a representation of their deeply seated hatred of people who don't neatly comport to their culture. So I just wanted to start today's episode with that. I'm getting ready to do an interview with Zoe Carpenter of The Nation, who has done some fabulous reporting on from Texas, from these facilities, and we're gonna dig deep into this. Joining me now is Zoe Carpenter. She is the Nation's Associate Washington Editor. She worked previously with Rolling Stone and has appeared on MSNBC, CNN, and other media outlets. Zoe, thanks so much for joining me. How are you today?
Nice to talk with you.
You've done some reporting from Texas, and I have to say your last piece honestly broke me apart, broke me into many different pieces. The situation that these children in particular are in as a result of specific decisions and strategic decisions by the Trump administration is really disheartening. Can you just give me a brief synopsis of what you saw there and some of your reporting?
Sure. So I went down to Texas last weekend, and on Sunday I toured a Border Patrol processing facility in McAllen, Texas. And McAllen is in the Rio Grande Valley. It's one of the busiest parts of the border in terms of the number of people crossing. And so that processing facility is where a lot of the people who are apprehended by the Border Patrol end up. It's one of the first stops, essentially. And that facility is also where many of the family separations are happening, or have been happening up to this point at least. And so we got, a brief tour from Border Patrol agents, and we did not have unlimited access to the facility. I think it's important to point out that it was very much a guided tour, and we weren't allowed to interview any of the kids and most of the parents. And that facility is pretty stark. It's supposed to be a temporary facility, so there's nothing in terms of toys or books for the kids. There were about 200 children who were on their own in that facility, kept in a couple of large chain link pens, essentially, when I was there.
And in your reporting, you mentioned that it was referred to as a kennel. There's a lot of debate over whether or not they're cages, but they're actually being referred to as kennels.
That's a nickname that facility has been referred to with by some advocates and people who've been inside it. And of course, it's not something that the border patrol would use.
Right.
But it does actually. I think it's a fairly accurate description. It's a large warehouse type space, 77,000 square feet, that's divided up by these chain link pens, and it's sort of like a dog run. Wow. I hate to say it, but that's true.
Wow. In your article, you wrote, the most recent one, you said immigrant children do not have a right to legal counsel. And even before the number of family separations shot up, there was a shortage of pro bono lawyers to represent children who crossed the border on their own. I bring that up because in the subsequent paragraph, you said that 9 out of 10 children without representation are ultimately deported. Here's a question that I want to ask here. How much of this is just a systemic problem that existed before Trump's recent policy versus how much of this is new?
That's a really great question. I can't give you an exact breakdown in terms of like 90% of this is Trump's fault and 10% is Obama's and Bush's or something like that. But right. I can say that certainly the practice of separating children from their families is completely new. And so that the Trump administration owns, that extra level of trauma and chaos from breaking apart over 2,000 families and not really having any processes in place to reunite them as far as anyone can tell. That is brand new. Oh. What is not new are some of the conditions that we're now seeing reports of in children's shelters or detention centers specifically, because the shelter system was really set up mostly in response to the 2014 influx of large numbers of unaccompanied children.
Right.
And so some of that is definitely related to the Obama administration. And then, of course, the practice of detaining families together in family detention centers, that goes back to the Bush and the Obama administrations.
So the May directive from Donald Trump to prosecute all unauthorized border crossers at the federal level rather than through immigration courts, that's like the source of both the increase in cases, but also the increase, the intentional increase in the number of children who are separated from their parents. This seems, and I think you've reported as much, this is a coordinated strategy by the administration to stop asylum seekers from ever getting their case actually heard. My question is this. Seeing that the president has such broad authority, constitutional authority to make our immigration policies, how do we actually stop this at a system level? Like what can Congress do, if anything, to stop the president of the United States from creating a systemic approach to exacerbating a problem like we have right now?
Well, his authority is not as broad as he would like us to believe. So, for example, you mentioned the asylum cases. The asylum laws of the country are set by Congress, and there's currently a lawsuit that the ACLU filed several months ago regarding the way the administration is handling some asylum seekers. So I think certainly there could be checks, and there should be checks on the way that asylum seekers are being processed right now, and especially asylum seekers who are being separated from their children. That seems to violate a lot of different procedures and rules. But I think in terms of what the rest of us who aren't lawyers can do, the most immediate thing is supporting the legal organizations that are helping reunite families, because really they're the only ones doing it. The administration does not seem to have a plan on its own of reuniting these families. And the time window could be pretty short, especially for parents who get put in expedited deportation processes. They could be deported within a matter of weeks while their children are still caught up in the Health and Human Services system, which is a completely separate system. So making sure that they have support, making sure that there's public pressure in the form of demonstrations and calling members of Congress so that they know that we're not just going to forget about these 2,300 children once and if the policies change.
There's another aspect of this. There's so many different angles to this that are heartbreaking and disturbing. But let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the executive order. Many people are looking at this, and many is not really quantitative, but some are looking at this as a type of victory. But in my reading of it, to me, it seems like this executive order can actually make the situation worse, particularly if it has the PR effect that Donald Trump wants it to have. If the pressure that people are putting on him is lifted because of this executive order, are there some structural things in the executive order that raises red flags for you?
Yes, definitely. So the major thing in the executive order is the statement of intent to try to dismantle the Flores settlement. And Flores was an agreement made in the late 90s in response to allegations of abusive conditions for children held in detention facilities. And it sets out some basic standards of care. It says that the government can't detain migrant children for longer than is absolutely necessary. It says they have to provide them with education and adequate living standards, things of that nature. And in Flores, as it's currently understood, would prevent the Trump administration from keeping immigrant families in family detention centers for indefinite amounts of time, which is what it wants to do now to sort of swap the family separation policy for a policy of indefinite internment. And so those two things, the intention to dismantle Flores and then the paired intention to keep families in what would amount to essentially internment camps indefinitely, those are the two main worries now. And immigration advocates are pretty clear that this is not an improvement. If anything, it's almost worse, and it certainly swaps one crisis for another. And
it looks as though we're getting ready to move to internment camps on military bases, reporting that he's up to as many 20,000 children and their families to be held on military bases. I mean, notwithstanding the obvious optics of this, there's just so many things about this that are patently wrong. I was reading Krugman's article in his column in the New York Times, where he's trying to understand this. He has a line that I think is fascinating and very accurate. He said, we don't have an immigration crisis. We have a hatred crisis. But then in the aspect of trying to understand the hatred, he couldn't really put his finger on why something like this, immigration, drives a wealthy individual like Donald Trump and drives, he gave a historical aspect of Henry Ford, with his dissemination of the anti-Semitic documents that he did at his time. You do, in addition to reporting, you've analyzed this. What's driving this from a political perspective for Donald Trump? Because it's simultaneously toxic, but it's also a winning issue. I'm still trying to get a balance on this. What's your take politically?
Well, my take politically is I think this kind of scapegoating is most effective on people who don't have relationships with immigrants or frankly with people of color. And we know that this country is still incredibly segregated. In some ways, it's more segregated now than several decades ago. School segregation is increasing, residential segregation is increasing. And so I think the president and the Republican Party in general has become very good at blaming any problem whatsoever, whether it's an economic problem or social divides, on people of color and especially immigrants. And so I think this is just a manifestation of that. Years and years of rhetoric that dehumanize immigrants. And now we're seeing that with the president referring to them as animals, saying that they're, quote, infesting the country. Right. And, it's interesting. I think it's true that this is effective on a certain slice of the Republican base. I do think that there is a portion of the middle, the small slice of America that is still moderate Republican, or still identifies as independents. I think this is really turning them off, and separating families does not poll well. I don't think we should overstate its political popularity. So I hesitate to call that good news because the situation generally is really horrible. But I think, fortunately, a majority of Americans do not believe that this is a good thing.
It's funny you should mention it like that. I literally said on my show yesterday that this is an unfortunate opportunity. I'm loath to say an opportunity because of what this is, right? What's happening, the real human toll that is, the toll that is taking on human lives. But we've, in a sense, finally found something that Donald Trump could be shamed by, right? This is actually a point where he's having to backtrack, even if it's only in a PR stunt fashion. But I agree with you. It's really difficult to talk about it in any type of positive sense. Particularly, I don't know, have you seen the video from ABC News of the 10-year-old Guatemalan boy who was just reunited with his father after 8 months? And there was genuine trauma in this child's eyes. I mean, it wasn't joyous like you would expect from, the videos we see of family reunions of someone in the military service. But this kid was so broken after 8 months of being separated from his father that he could not express emotion at all. And I mean, I want you to speak to that, but also the fact that when we talked about at the top of the show, the 60% of children who are separated, they're treated as unaccompanied, and then they are far more likely to be deported. They're also deported without their parents. Like, we're causing real separation and real trauma in the lives of these children and these adults. Could you just speak about that, particularly since you've been down there and you've seen the faces and you spent time with them?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to untangle how all of these varying levels of trauma, because I think we have to remember that many of these kids, if not most of them, are already fleeing from trauma when they make the journey to the U.S. Right. They're coming from countries that have become destabilized, and they may be living in danger for their lives and their families' lives. And then they have to make a journey that is, by all accounts, extremely arduous and dangerous. So that's two types of trauma already. And then they get to the border. Crossing the border is another level of difficulty. And then there's the trauma of family separation and being moved around. As we know, some of these kids are being flown as far away as Michigan and New York from the border region. And you can't argue with the statement that this is going to have some profound effect on these kids. I mean, professional child development experts have called this child abuse. And it's interesting when you hear Republicans talk about immigrant youths being, becoming part of MS-13. There's no better way to destabilize a community than to traumatize its children. Right. And so it doesn't do anything to make America more secure. If that is your only concern, and I don't think that should be our only concern, but if that's your concern, this is an incredibly bad policy. Right. And then in terms of the legal situation that these kids are in, yes, it's true. They have to find their own lawyers now. Once they are separated from their parents, they're treated as if they're unaccompanied children from the beginning, as if they crossed the border on their own. Their legal cases are separated from their parents, and many of these kids are being left to represent themselves in immigration court, which is ludicrous. I mean, some of these kids are pre-verbal. There's no legal right to an attorney for these kids, and deportation could mean being sent back to a country where their parents may or may not be, and where they may face truly mortal danger.
Zoe, I really could talk to you about this. It needs to be talked about so much more than we are. But I thank you so much for your time. Zoe Carpenter, the Nation's associate Washington editor. Thank you so much for your reporting on this.
Well, thanks for having me on the show.
Not to beat a dead horse, but I really just, I find two things that are extremely popular that I don't engage in, which is probably my fault, right? Maybe I should just engage in these two activities because, I mean, my show would be far more popular. People love to hear what they want to hear. They rarely want to hear what they need to hear. But I noticed a video from Jimmy Dore that, has quite, I think, 150,000 views, a nice amount of views on YouTube rather. And then there's a video from one of my old friends, Professor Boyce Watkins or Dr. Boyce Watkins. The video from Jimmy Dore is focusing on the fact that Hillary Clinton had a similar dialogue or a similar conversation as to the kids, that just because they come here with kids, that, doesn't mean that they're going to stay. Okay. Fair enough. She said that. And it's a problem. It is a problem. However, is it a problem that deserves our energy right now? I mean, it is extremely profitable. Let me get to the cut to the chase, right? It is extremely profitable to be a whatabouter, to engage in whataboutisms. Particularly whataboutisms that allow you to not focus attention on the actual problem, but to focus attention on what everybody is still angry about, the 2016 election and the primaries. I mean, what better way to, get clicks than to engage in this? And I'm sure he has some, other coverage. I don't know, what he's doing in terms of using his platform to actually try to affect change in this area. And he can do what he wants to with his platform. But I just see how popular it is. And this is a result of us, the people, we the people. And similarly, Boyce Watkins, love him. I mean, he was one of the first people to actually put me on. I mean, when everyone else was ignoring my work, Dr. Watkins put me on first, the first one. And, but, I'm seeing all along his timelines and all his videos that are just talking about, America doesn't care about black people as much as they care about immigrants, and Democrats are just using black folks and blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. And that shit is popular in black circles. I mean, that's really where you can go and get, millions of views off of that type of sentiment because people love that type of whether or not it's useful, whether or not it's actually going to empower the black community more. Similarly with Jimmy Dore, that's not his whole position. That's not actually going to change anything for people who feel disenfranchised from the 2016 election. All it's going to do is to keep you mad. Similarly to what Fox News does and what the alt-right does and the intellectual dark web. What they do, they keep their audiences riled up with stuff that's its only usefulness is to keep you angry for clicks. And maybe I'm the dumb one. Because I don't engage in that. I can't engage in that. You're going to more likely be upset after listening to my show than you would be upset with me, than you will be upset with the person you want to be upset with. Because I'm here to tell you the truth about the situations. Yes, there are systemic problems in our immigration system that President Obama did not fix. Yes, some of these problems pre-existed Donald Trump, but I am not going to whatabouts you into saying that, well, it's a wash, because what Donald Trump is doing is uniquely different. No, I do know that there are problems facing the black community. Of course I know that. Of course I know that there are problems facing the black community that are still unanswered, that are still not addressed, that our allies do let us down on from time to time. But nevertheless, that does not mean we are to turn our backs on issues of justice and morality. I'm not doing this. I'm not doing the work that I'm doing in hopes of getting some some immigrant in the future to be on my side on something. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. So ultimately, it's a statement about us, our predilections, and what it is that we want to be angry about, what it is that drives us, that same thing that Donald Trump understands about his base, that ability to rile them up, to scratch that particular itch right where they're itching, that bigoted itch. Donald Trump knows the game just as much as anyone else, and he knows that he can continuously vilify a certain group. So the real question is who do you want to vilify? It's very popular right now to vilify Hillary Clinton and to focus on her no matter what. If you can make a situation about Hillary Clinton, you are going to get hundreds of thousands of views and you're going to do just fine. Or if you can vilify white liberals and make everything about white liberals and white Democrats, hurting the black community and holding, black folks on the black plantation. These are talking points that actually came from the black nationalist community that were co-opted by white folks in the intellectual dark web and alt-right people who are now saying it, that they're now the ones who are saying you got to get off the Democratic plantation. But that started in the black community. So if you want to vilify Hillary Clinton, you can make a lot of money. If you want to vilify white liberals, you can make a lot of money. If you want to vilify immigrants, you can go all the way to the White House. I don't know, but I don't know what is even the point of me mentioning this other than to say, make sure. Well, actually, before I give you the kicker, before I give you the chaser, here's the shot. These same people. Every single one of them, from the Jimmy Dores to the Boyce Watkins, love you Boyce, but it's true, to Donald Trump, to the alt-right, they are all going to tell you, they're projecting on you exactly what they're doing to their audience. They're going to say, you allow those folks to tell you what to be angry about, right? They all say the same thing. Simultaneously, here's the chaser, here's the kicker. They are giving you what they want you to be angry about. And they're monetizing it to the detriment of justice. I would rather, I don't pretend that I'm going to be poor always and that I'm going to always have a small audience. I am going to build this, still building this. But I would rather speak truth to power and never become, quote unquote, successful or big time than to sell out my principle and to tell you simply what you want to hear versus what I perceive to be the absolute truth, even if it's something that you don't want to hear, whether you like it or not. This would be great if it was on my Like It or Not show. That would have been a hell of a closing, but it's not. All right. That's all the time I have for you today. Thanks so much for hanging out with me. It's always been a pleasure. Every time we speak, I count it a privilege. So thanks for hanging out with me. Be sure to go to patreon.com/the BPD show and become a patron. Help this working class bloke. Anyway, have a great weekend, everyone. Special thanks to Zoe for doing the show with me. Hopefully I can get her back on. Great reporting. And that's it. Have a great weekend. I will see you next week. Bye-bye.
The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.